What is the Brownsville Raid? Well, to understand, we have to know that even at the time of this incident in 1906, there was still a lot of racial injustice. Majority of the people who lived in Brownsville at the time were white, and few other races like Latino and African American. More so, African Americans were forced to live by the color line mandate that was given to them from the white citizens of Brownsville. Black soldiers were stationed at the Fort Brown, that even today is still set up on the TSC side of campus. The group of black soldiers were called the 25th Infantry Regime. Even then, nothing got better for the African Americans. On a reported attack on a white woman on the night of August 12, 1906, the current mayor, Frederick Combe, had declared an early curfew for all the soldiers at the fort. The next day, on August 13th, a white bartender was killed and a police officer was badly injured by gunshot wounds. The people of the Brownsville area began to blame the 25th Regime, which were a group of 167 black soldiers. The white commanders at Fort Brown did confirm that the black soldiers were at the barracks at the time of the incident. Mayor Combe did not budge too much and still claimed that some of the soldiers that were black did in fact participate in the shooting. What led the mayor to suspect that the black soldiers did commit the shootings is that there were spent bullet cartridges from the issued rifles that would belonged to the 25th Regime. At the time of this, Teddy Roosevelt was running for office, and he didn't tell majority of the population of the United States about the Brownsville Raid, because if he did, the black population wouldn't vote for him. Later, it did come out that the Brownsville Raid did happen, and the supporters of the National Association of Colored Women and the Niagara Movement tried to help out the discharged soldiers, but ultimately failed. Later, in the 1970s, when President Nixon was in office, John D. Weaver published The Brownsville Raid. They gave a more in-depth analysis of the Brownsville Raid. Weaver's book made headwaves that Congressman Augustus F. Hawkins of the Los Angeles introduced a bill to have the Defense Department reinvestigate the Brownsville Raid. Finally, in 1972, all of the 167 members of the 25th Infantry Regime were now honorably discharged, without back pay by President Nixon. Sadly, only one man was alive by the time Nixon had honorably discharged them in 1973. The last survivor only received a tax-free pension and a $25,000 reward. But to find out in more depth about this time in history, I talked to one of the UTRGV's U.S. history professors for more in-depth analysis about the Brownsville Raid, Dr. Jamalin Harp. Alright, so what is the Brownsville Raid?
So the Brownsville Raid refers to an incident that happened in Brownsville, Texas in August 1906. There were African American troops stationed in Brownsville. At the time, they were from the 25th Infantry, and there were racial tensions within the city of Brownsville between white Americans and the black American troops. And on August 12th, there had been a supposed attack on a white woman. So in order to make sure that there were no further issues, the military men, the soldiers, were put on curfew. Well, the next day on August 13th, there were people running down the streets of Brownsville. There were shots fired. One man was killed. A bartender named Frank Natus was killed. And after the fact, Brownsville residents said that they witnessed African American soldiers running around the streets. This testimony has been called problematic because it was dark outside, and the people who testified that they had seen things that were from a far distant vantage point, so it's called into question how reliable of witnesses that they were, and that the soldiers were supposed to be on the base at the time. Well, the way that things progressed, citizens of Brownsville were adamant that it was the soldiers who had fired in the streets of Brownsville that evening, and it resulted in the military recommending to President Teddy Roosevelt that the soldiers be dismissed, specifically because they refused to confess and say what had happened. They all said this was not us. They pled innocent. And so Roosevelt had them all dismissed, dishonorably discharged from the Army. 167 people, black soldiers, dismissed from the Army. It was the largest summary dismissal in U.S. Army history. And a Senate committee later investigated, and though there were a few dissenters within that committee, the committee on the whole officially upheld the White House's decision. Later, in the 1970s, it was reopened and the military reinvestigated, and they restored the reputation of those soldiers and said that they should not have been discharged from the Army.
Why is the Brownsville Raid significant?
The Brownsville Raid is significant for several reasons. Any time in history that you have an incident that shows such racial injustice or injustice of any kind, that is historically significant. And again, this is the largest summary dismissal in U.S. military history. 167 people were discharged from the Army dishonorably, and so that is significant. It's significant for the racial tensions that are happening in the U.S. in the 20th century. We see things that are a big current within the United States. There is a deep-seated white fear about white women having relationships with African American men, or African American men attacking white women. We see that element within this. This is a little bit of what got that started on that August 12th date, the idea that a white woman had been attacked and the fear that an African American man had been involved. So that is certainly significant as well. It's significant for how the federal government and the military reacted, and a lot of people argue that they did not act according to the laws of justice, that they skirted around justice and how things should have been done. And it's significant for what happens later in the 1970s, that in the midst of the civil rights movement, in the midst of, or after a scholar writes a book on the Brownsville Raid, the military reinvestigates, and they try to connect or correct wrongs that had been done previously. So it speaks to the importance of looking into the past again, reinvestigating things, and seeing what wrongs need to be at least tried to have them amended.
Why do you think the 25th regime soldiers were targeted?
The 25th infantry soldiers were targeted because of their race. Before they even arrived in Brownsville, the citizens of Brownsville were against their being stationed here. There was already that racial tension before they arrived here. Once they did arrive here, they received discrimination from a lot of local businesses that did not want to serve them. Their race was very much the undercurrent of all of this.
What was Booker T. Washington's reaction about President Roosevelt's decision?
Booker T. Washington was a prominent member within the African American community, a leader within the African American community. He was one of the most respected members of the African American community from the white community. And Washington, along with many other members of the black community, were upset by the turn of events in Brownsville, how this had all transpired. And so Booker T. Washington was connected. He had a relationship of some sort with the Roosevelt administration. So he reached out to the administration and asked for reconsideration, asked for time in thinking about this dismissal. But the answer he received from the Roosevelt administration was not the one he hoped for. Roosevelt said, unless there are new facts, we are proceeding with the dismissal of these soldiers. Washington's view about making lives better for African Americans, he tended to take the side of arguing for economic improvement, job improvement, working on making their lives better where they were at that moment in time. He was less focused on political participation and ending discrimination, particularly within the South. And his mentality shows in what he does at this point in time, in that he accepts Roosevelt's answer, his answer that he is going to proceed with this dismissal rather than relook at the facts. And so Washington accepts that, and he does not denounce Roosevelt in a public way. He believes that it would do more harm to the African American community to turn this into a fight with Roosevelt than it would be to instead maintain his good relationship with the president.
Why do you think President Roosevelt dishonorably discharged the 167 enlisted men that were in the 25th Regiment?
President Teddy Roosevelt was receiving information from the military that was here, from the general who was here inspecting, and he was receiving, their suggestions. So he is following what his general has suggested that he do, that they dismiss them all from the military because of this, quote, conspiracy of silence, that they've banded together and they're refusing to testify and refusing to confess to having committed these alleged crimes. And so Roosevelt is following that. And really, Roosevelt's actions dismayed a lot of the African American community, because Roosevelt had fought with black troops in the War of 1898. He had appointed African Americans to positions within the government. And so it took African Americans, it took them back a little bit, because they thought that he is a progressive president. They thought perhaps he might be moving the country forward. And so they were shocked and dismayed that this was his action. And some African Americans at the time wondered, Roosevelt had just toured the South, a region of the country with heavy white supremacy and discrimination against African Americans, and they wondered if Roosevelt had been too influenced by that.
Why was the news of the discharge of the 25th regime kept a secret until after 1906 during the congressional elections?
Roosevelt was worried about the congressional elections, worried about the election in 1906. This event is happening in August 1906. The election is in November 1906. And worried about losing the African American vote, quite frankly. Worried that if they hear about this news, that they will either not show up to vote, they'll vote for the Democratic Party. So wanting to maintain a hold on Congress for the Republican Party, which is Teddy Roosevelt's party. And some African Americans respond to that, and they said he is using this personal incident for political gain, and he is playing politics with this situation that he should not be playing politics with.
Do you think by giving the remaining survivors a tax-free pension and a $25,000 reward could make up for what they did? And if not, why?
So by the time that they did that, they reversed the ruling, and they gave this $25,000 pension. There's only one living survivor, Dorsey Willis. And this is an area that historians generally try to not pass too much judgment on, because it can even be, an individual thing. What did that money mean to personally that person in their life at that point in time? But in general, historians recognize in these sort of situations that something like the Brownsville Raid did damage to people's lives. It altered the course of their lives, and generally that's considered money after the fact is not considered to make up for it, as much as historians give this sort of leeway to make those kind of assertions and judgments.
How could have this been prevented?
So historians, again, historians try not to, what I call what if history, and think about alternate ways that history might have gone, unless we're just thinking about it for the sake of having fun, but not in any way that we think about it too seriously. But I think if we think about the ways this could have been prevented, it does show some important things. It shows that the military and the federal government did not act how they should have, according to the historical record. A Cameron County grand jury, met to consider 12 of those soldiers who had been arrested, and they found that there was not sufficient evidence for them to go to trial. So that was an action that happened within the court of law, and the military and the White House are acting outside of that, even though a Cameron County jury said we don't have enough evidence here to have these people go to trial. So perhaps perhaps an extent to which, along the way, if the military had acted differently, if the government had acted differently, they could have not had it in this way for the Brownsville troops. And one possible argument, which is definitely problematic, is that they stationed troops in an area that was hostile to those troops from the get-go. But again, that is problematic because it's difficult for the course of progress if they just keep troops away because the people there don't like them. They have these racial prejudices. That's a tricky thing to get at.
The last question is, who do you think this incident in history is to blame?
Blame is a tricky thing in history. These soldiers were accused by a population that has racial bias against them. And so that is definitely a factor and a component. Historians generally, while definitely not excusing actions of the past, try to remember that these people grew up in a particular time and setting and context, and we try to remember, or not pass judgments on what we might have done instead, because we did not grow up in that time and place, so we cannot say for sure. But that is definitely a component, that there is this racial tension there, and people gave testimony that was unsound testimony, arguably, according to most historical records. And then again, the military and the federal government, the way that they held 167 people accountable for what a few people potentially did, and really a lot of the evidence was showing that it wasn't the African American soldiers that they were accusing. So if we give blame, a fair amount of it probably would go to the military and the federal government.